So it's my pleasure to open this lecture tonight, which is dedicated to the theme of unity and identity, Jewish-Christian relation in their ecumenical context. I'm Rabbi David Meyer. I'm a professor of rabbinic literature and contemporary Jewish thought here at the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies at the Gregorian University. And I wish to convey really to all of you greetings on behalf of Professor Massimo Gargiulio, the pro-director of the Bea Center of the university, and unfortunately, due to some personal reason, Professor Gargiulio could not join us this evening. So let me, on his behalf, welcome those who have joined us this evening, both in presence in this room and also online on the YouTube channel. All of us at the Bea Center, we take always great comfort in being able to continue our work on dialogue despite the agonies, really, of the current times, in particular in the Middle East, but not only. And we are very strongly committed in our mission to increase the knowledge of Judaism and Jewish-Christian relation and create a space, whatever the external circumstances are, for dialogue and interaction, and this becomes even more relevant in painful moments. So it is my pleasure to now give the floor to the rector of our university, Father Mark Lewis, for his introductory remarks and his words of welcome.
Your Excellency, Ambassador Schutz, Your Excellency, Monsignor Vidal, Mrs. Brenninkmeyer. I'd like to also welcome Professor Father Rafael Vasquez Jimenez, Secretary of the Commission for Interreligious Dialogue of the Spanish Episcopal Conference, but most importantly, an alumnus of our university. Also, Rabbi Noam Marans of the American Jewish Committee, Director of Interreligious and Intergroup Relations. So, dear honored guests, dear professors and students, friends all, I welcome you to the 23rd Annual Brenninkmeyer Veran Lecture on Unity and Identity, Jewish-Christian Identity in their ecumenical context. As always, the topic and quality of the presentations of this lecture series anticipate interesting discussions and interchange. In my 3 or 4 years of association with this lecture, I've learned a great deal, and I've not always been able to stay for the end, but I've always wanted to. But more importantly, we have made connections, friendships, plans together, all of which are a living example of how unity can be forged. It is always important to thank those who have made this event possible and our coming together possible. It's a good and important initiative, and we are thankful for everyone who supports it. I look forward to hearing the presentations this evening. I have an intuition that our coming together deepens those things we share in common. The fact that we are people committed to life and to hope and to care for each other and our common world provides the basis for friendship and trust. It's an important example to give in the midst of our world, which seems to esteem death, despair, ego isolation. I don't want to step on anyone's presentation, but I cannot help to think that this is all incredibly important. We are also mindful when we last gathered here as Christians and Jews last October, we were at the brink of a war that continues to afflict our world. We pray for a quick, just, and lasting peace for the land that we call holy. We must see and pray that others will come to see that peace is the better solution. You will also know by now that the pro-director of the Bea Center, Professor Massimo Gargiulio, is not with us this evening because he is mourning the loss of his father. So let us pray for him as well, for the consolation of his family, and for the blessing that Franco, his father, was to his family and through Massimo to us. I don't need to take any more time away from our event So I wish you all an enjoyable evening, and thank you for your presence and attention and friendship. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Lewis. My name is Donna Orsuto, and I teach here at the Gregorian Spiritual Theology. And I'm very happy to moderate this session this afternoon. And I'd like to just begin immediately by inviting our first speaker, whom you've already met, Rabbi David, Dr. David Meyer, and invite him to speak to introduce the session with the question, what is at stake? So with that, I invite you to speak.
Well, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. As you said, the title of my very short introduction today is really what is at stake, just a few words with a question mark. What is at stake when we want to address the issue of Jewish-Christian relation in their ecumenical context? So let me start by doing something which I normally don't do, at least in public, is to talk about an article that I published, and that was just a little bit before October 7th. We were then faced with the apocalyptic tensions within the Israeli societies, tensions that not only brought the country to a total societal and political paralysis, but also to the brink of civil unrest. And at the time, I attempted to reflect on a way one could envision to heal the wounds and the divides within Israel. The article was published in a Belgian newspaper, and it was later translated and published here in Italy as well. And my argument was that Israeli Jews, divided as they were and as they still are, would be well advised to use a Christian ecumenical terminology to not only qualify the nature of their divisions, but also to maybe find a narrow path to heal a broken reality. And citing a Dutch cultural historian, Johan Huizinga, who structured more than a century ago Jewish identity along the fractured line between what he called Catholic Jews and Protestant Jews, the Catholic Jews advocating for a social and political life modeled on an all-encompassing religious view, and the Protestant Jews, in reaction, advocating a greater individual and cultural freedom, valuing the independence of the self. I argue in that paper that Jews in Israel today, in the midst of the raging civil tensions, remain shaped and animated by the fundamental religious identity of our Christian brothers. Israel was not, therefore, just the battleground of religious Jews versus secular Jews. It wasn't just right versus left. It wasn't just peacemaker versus warmongers. Israel was and is the place of an unresolved tension between Catholic Jews and Protestant Jews. Now, the article posited that maybe if this analysis captured some level of truth, we Jews would be well advised to learn from the Christian ecumenical dialogue to try and find a path to resolve our inner tensions. Now, why recall all this in these introductory remarks? Because it happens that the Catholic dialogue with Judaism, as we know, is lodged within the dicastery for the unity of Christians. Now, if this might be somehow natural for you, let me confess that even after 15 years of being present at the Gregorian teaching here, this is still far from obvious for me. Now, a Jew facing that reality is in many ways, and I've experienced it hundreds of times, overwhelmed by questions. What does that mean? Am I seen as a Christian in some sort of way, either in a retrievable past or maybe in an unexpected future. If this were to be the case, that would lead to the end of dialogue. Or could it be, in a wiser and maybe more intriguing way, that the church felt in lodging dialogue with the Jews and Judaism in such a dicastery that the reality of the other, meaning me for you and you for me, had to be apprehended and understood in some ways through a more internal and internalized dialogue, as if maybe something of the outside needed to penetrate really the inside of our respective identities. But how are external and internal dialogue related? And this is what is at stake when we evoke such a topic. So let me share a short personal example to illustrate my point. I'm a rabbi. I'm not an Orthodox rabbi. Now, between the Orthodox Jewish world in all of its shades and the non-Orthodox Jewish world also in all of its shades, relations are very tense, if not mostly non-existent. While we do not have official schism, you understand from my words that we too have our own ecumenical challenges. Now, it happened that I'm probably one of the very few non-Orthodox rabbis, by pure luck, who has been invited to teach rabbinic midrash in an Orthodox yeshiva. It's almost unheard of. And I often wondered why. Why did they invite me? I was, of course, first tempted to think maybe it's my insightful knowledge of rabbinic Judaism, but I know that is not the case. The truth is different. The truth is that it is because I teach here. It's because I teach here at the Pontifical University, in the heart of Rome, in the heart of the Catholic world. And my involvement with you has turned out to be a sufficient trigger to overcome, at least in one instance, and even if it's a small instance, the utter reluctance of Jews to engage with Jews belonging to the other side of the Jewish affiliation spectrum. It has, in a way, in a small way, created a little crack in that wall. And this is how, at times, Jewish-Christian dialogue can shape, in a unique way, ecumenical dialogue, which I understand here in the Jewish sense of the word. So let me conclude this introduction with a reference to what I normally do here at the Gregorian, which is I teach Midrash, Talmud, rabbinic literature. So I will cite a very short Talmudic commentary. It's a commentary on a verse from the book of Exodus, chapter 25, verses 11. It's about the building of the tabernacle, the Mishkan. You should overlay it with pure gold inside out. The Mishkan has to have gold inside out. Now, the meaning of this verse is relatively straightforward. The tabernacle must have gold on the outside, but again, on the inside as well. And any normally gifted artisan will know how to do that. You create a tabernacle and you plate it with gold outside and inside. It's not rocket science. But the Talmudic sages have a different take on the story. They said that Bezalel, who was the chief artisan at the time, didn't build a tabernacle, it built 3 tabernacles. 2 of gold and 1 of wood. The larger one of gold for the outside. And inside, in the middle, there was the tabernacle of wood. And the smallest one also of gold, inside the middle one, a little bit like Russian dolls. The two tabernacles of gold, one inside and one outside, acted as a protection to the tabernacle of wood, who was buried deep in the middle. And maybe this is the image we should keep in our mind as we reflect on this inspiring relationship between external religious dialogue and ecumenical dialogue. Both are like the tabernacle of gold. Both dialogue shine like gold. But it is the interaction between the two that might in the end touch and perhaps shape the tabernacle of wood that is really in the middle and that is almost never visible. And I like to think that beyond the shining achievement of dialogue between the church and Judaism on the outside as the outer layer of gold, and between the churches in the internal ecumenical dialogue as an inner layer of gold, then it is really something of our softer identities in the very heart of our beings that is really refined and changed when we engage in the dynamic of the outer and the inner dialogue. And this, to me, is really what tonight is at stake. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Meyer, for that thoughtful introduction and for sharing also your personal experience, and especially for that beautiful image of the building of the three tabernacles, two of gold and one of wood, as a way of reflecting on the inspiring relationship between external dialogue and ecumenical dialogue. As you say, both are like gold. They both shine like gold. But it's that interaction between the two that might, in the end, touch and shape the tabernacle of wood that is in the middle. So thank you for that image to help open up our dialogue this evening. I'd like to move now to our next speaker, who will help us to understand why and how the dialogue with Judaism became lodged in the dicastery for promoting Christian unity. This is a big question for us tonight. And to help us with that is Father Christian Ruteshauser, a Jesuit, the delegate for higher education of the Central European Province of the Society of Jesus. And he is designated professor for Jewish Studies and Theology at the University of Lucerne in Switzerland. So turn it over to you.
Good evening to everybody. So I just try to give an answer why and how the dialogue with Judaism became lodged into the dicastery of the unity of Christians. So it's a historical approach. On June 13th, 1960, Pope John the 23rd received the Jewish historian Jules Isaac, who presented him with the request that the Church should revise its doctrine of contempt towards the Jewish people. Inspired by the conversation with Isaac and having been sensitized to the issue for some time, the Pope immediately gave Cardinal Bea the task of including the renewal of relations with Judaism in the Council's agenda. Why did the Pope entrust Judaism to Cardinal Bea? On the one hand, Judaism was perceived theologically by the Pope and by Catholic theology at the time as the people of the Old Testament. As an Old Testament scholar, Cardinal Bea was an expert in this field. On the other hand, the Pope had already entrusted to Cardinal Bea entrusted him with the newly created Secretariat for Christian Unity. For the question of ecumenism and the question of Judaism, both of which were new for a council, the Pope chose Bea as a man he trusted in, and he set him up a secretariat with own authority. The secretariat had to find its own place in a council's process, alongside the theological commission, which was the traditional and usual agent for questions of doctrine. The fact that Judaism was assigned to the Secretariat for Christian Unity was therefore the result of a strategic decision and a personal relationship. However, such a reason alone would not have withstood the process before, during, and after the Council, in which different structures were created and content-related topics were shifted. There are strong theological reasons for the proximity of the Jewish and the ecumenical matter. The Pope probably had them half intuitively and half consciously in mind, I think. They are linked through the fundamental question of the role of the Church and Judaism in history of salvation. And this church, of course, is split into different denominational churches. Although the debate on Jews centered during the Council time and again on the question of the deicide accusation and on the Jewish rejection by God, one had finally to find a renewed theology of the relationship of the Church to Judaism within the history of salvation. It was obvious for all fathers of the Council that Judaism does not come to the Church from the outside, but that it precedes it. Through the Old Testament, which is an integral part of the Christian Bible, the Jews' Torah is part of Christian revelation. During his visit to the synagogue in Rome in 86, John Paul II even stated that Judaism is part of the interior of Christianity. And Nostra Aetate will open the paragraph on Judaism by stating that the Church encounters Judaism when it ponders on its own mystery. The binomial inside-outside shows that for the Church, Judaism cannot be subsumed under any interreligious relations. In 1974, the Vatican guidelines for the implementation of the Conciliar Declaration Nostra Aetate 4 will formulate, I quote, "The problem of Jewish-Christian relations concerns the Church as such, since it is when pondering on her own mystery that she encounters the mystery of Israel. Therefore, even in areas where no Jewish communities exist, this remains an important problem. There is also an ecumenical aspect to the question. The very turn of Christians to the sources and origins of their faith, grafted onto the earlier covenant, helps the search for unity in Christ, the cornerstone." End of quote. The relationship to Judaism, even beyond specific Jewish communities and Jewish men and women, shows that this relationship is also about an inner question of the Church about her identity and self-definition. During the Council itself, the declaration on Judaism prepared by Cardinal Bea was initially pushed closer to the question of ecumenism by external circumstances. The draft text could not be presented at the first session in autumn 62. The opposition of the Arab bishops was too strong. They feared Jewish agitation behind the declaration on Judaism and the politicization of the Council through the Israel-Palestinian conflict. In reaction to it, Cardinal Bea worked to show that the Church's relationship with Judaism is purely theological for the Council. He drafted a text and presented it in the second session as the fourth chapter of the planned decree on ecumenism. When presenting the draft in the plenary, he emphasized, in a true sense, the Church is the continuation of the chosen people of Israel. However, there was no discussion of chapter 4 during this session, nor of chapter 5 on religious freedom. The debates on the previous chapters concerning ecumenism were all too long dragging on. Whether Cardinal Bea delayed the discussion on chapter 4 and 5 in order not to have to vote on them is debatable. In any case, at the end of the session, Cardinal Bea only asked the Council Fathers to submit written suggestions for improving the text. A new draft, consisting of part on Judaism and a part on non-Christians, was presented to the Council Fathers in the third session in autumn 64. Cardinal Bea again emphasized the proximity of the Jewish question to ecclesiology and to ecumenism. For the first time, the text was hotly debated in the plenary assembly. During the dispute, which is referred to as the October crisis in the historiography of the Council, anti-Semitic slander was leveled that Cardinal Bea and his colleagues were infiltrated by Jews. However, it was legitimate to demand that the Church not only redefines its relationship with Judaism, but also with other religions in more explicit and a theological way. Consequently, part 2 of the text was rewritten during the session. At the end, the Council Fathers voted separately on both parts, on the part on Judaism and that on religions, and for both in favor. During the session, Secretary of State Cardinal Ciccioniani, an opponent of any declaration on Judaism, proposed that Judaism will be dealt with in a subchapter of the Constitution on the Church. He wanted to de-emphasize the subject. This did, however, not reflect a majority opinion. But Cardinal Bea expressed the intention to append the entire text the Council Fathers voted on to the forthcoming Constitution on the Church. Although a kind of holy war was waged over this text throughout the spring and summer 1965, Cardinal Bea revised it only slightly, as the text had 95% of the votes. He presented the old and new slightly revised version at the fourth session in October 65. Within 2 weeks, the amendments were discussed and integrated. On October 28, the known to us Nostra Aetate text was adopted with 2,221 votes in favor and 88 against. The result of the highly controversial process is obviously not an independent declaration on Judaism. Judaism is also neither part of Lumen Gentium, the Constitution on the Church, or of Unitatis Redintegratio, the decree on ecumenism. Rather, the Declaration on Judaism has grown into a declaration on all religions. Nostra Aetate's title is Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions. There is no mention of the Jewish people or the state of Israel in Nostra Aetate. Judaism is now categorized among religions and yet distinguished from them. While the former are presented as the answer to the great questions of humanity and the Church recognizes in them the elements that are true and holy, Judaism stands at the origin of the Church. The Church emerged from it. Christianity and Judaism are linked by a spiritual bond and heritage. Together, they await eschatological fulfillment. Overlooking all the texts proclaimed by the Council, we can say, Nostra Aetate itself contains no reference to Lumen Gentium and Unitatis Redintegratio. Judaism also not appears in the decree on ecumenism. Besides Nostra Aetate, Judaism is only mentioned in Lumen Gentium as the religious closest to the Church, no more and no less. It would have been desirable if the texts had referred to each other. However, in view of the working methods of the Council, this was not possible. In any case, the Vatican document, the calling and the grace of God are irrevocable on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, will describe the relationship between Judaism and Christianity in a lengthy 7 paragraphs and underline its unique character differing from interreligious relation as well as from ecumenism. A theology that closely linked the Jewish-Christian relationship with the ecumenical question was present during the entire conciliar process. It is present in many speeches and texts by Cardinal Bea and of the voters who supported the elaboration of a renewed theology on Judaism. In part, it was not able to gain much of a hearing, as all forces had to be concentrated on rejecting the deicide reproach and the theology of God cursing the Jews, as I said above. But 2 of its main features may be presented here at the end of my short paper. On the one hand, this is the view, the ecclesiology developed by Yves Congar. Congar described the Church as the people of God as it is widely incorporated in the text Lumen Gentium. But it was a new notion in ecclesiology. But the notion of being God's people represents a central self-understanding of Judaism. If Judaism and the Church each see themselves as the peoples of God, then they have a core element in common in their self-understanding, as problematic it is and full of tensions. And so, as Jesus Christ is the common core element to all churches in the ecumenical relationship. That means it is not only the intricate binomial outside-inside that points to the interconnectedness of Christians and Jews. The common calling into the covenant with God also points to the interlocking of identities. Of course, that's all out of a Catholic theological perspective. From the Jewish side, that's something different. I don't want to go into it here. And the second feature of this theology, who really approaches ecumenism and Jewish-Christian relations, is more explicit during the Council. Erich Pschibara stated that divisions between the churches were preceded by a primordial schism, a primordial rift in the people of God, namely the division between Jews and Christians. In addition, Council observer Karl Barth stated, I quote, "We should not forget that there is ultimately only one truly great ecumenical question, our relationship with Judaism." End of quote. But no one else had attempted to describe the Jewish-Christian relation as an ecumenical relationship in such detail as Paul Demont. Paul Demont, he grew up in Budapest, was raised as a secular Jew, and then converted to Christianity and joined finally the Frères de Sion. He had a close friend, he was a close friend of Jules Isaac since the Seelisberg Conference in 1947. From 1948 to 1955, he directed the Cahiers Sioniens and disseminated his theology. Cardinal Bea was familiar with it. Demont developed his thinking in his never completely doctoral thesis on Romans 9 to 11. The theological relationship to Judaism was thus no longer read from the passion story of the Gospels, but from the theology of the letter to the Romans. That was the decisive shift. The letter to the Romans, Demont read that Israel was only temporarily hardened, not cursed by God, and in eschatological times all Israel will be saved. Demont linked the Paulinian view with the mystery of Israel with 3 ecclesiological reflections. with Yves Congar's Ecclesiology of the Church as the People of God, with the Church as mystery as developed by Pius XII in his encyclical Mystici Corporis, and with the ecumenical realization that the one Church of Christ is divided into denominational churches. He thus no longer defined the relationship with Judaism in missionary terms, but as a primordial schism that precedes all church divisions. At the end of time, the coming together of Jews and Christians should restore the Catholicity that the Church currently lacks. Therefore, the Jewish-Christian relationship has to be directed to an eschatological Catholicity that reaches out to all mankind, to all people. So let me conclude with a quote by Paul Desmond. In 1952, 10 years before the Council opens, he wrote for the opening of the Week for Christian Unity. I quote, "Jews are not Christians, and that they are not people to be proselytized, nor a people still alienated from the people of God. If they are not separated Christians, they are separated members of the people of God, but members separated from him by a rupture that did not occur like the others in the already formed church, but at the moment of their birth within the ancient people of God." End of quote. Desmond's theology and thinking led to establish the Dies Judaicus, the Day of Judaism, celebrated on January 17th, the day before the Week for Christian Unity. And as you know, it is held here in Italy, in Austria, in Poland, in the Netherlands, and in other countries. And I think even more Episcopal conferences should introduce this Day of Judaism in their churches. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Father Ruetishauser, for that really insightful historical overview that really helps us to understand that it's not a random choice that Judaism has been placed by the Church within the dicastery for the promotion of Christian unity. And as you said, a theology that closely links the Jewish-Christian relationship within the ecumenical question was present during the entire conciliar process. One of the things that I found particularly enlightening, especially in this context here, was the role of Cardinal Bea, how prophetic he was and how amazing how he was involved in this process. So thank you very much, and I'm sure this is going to lead to more dialogue as we go forward. So the next segment of our colloquium will touch upon practical questions of how our experience of dialogue with one another can transform us, how it changes us, how it helps to create friendship and trust, how it challenges us. So our next speaker is Reverend Dr. Kendall Solon. He's a professor of systematic theology at Emory University. And he will address the theme, how talking with Jews has changed how I think of myself as a Christian.
Thank you. It is a great pleasure for me to reflect on the theme, how talking with Jews has changed how I think of myself as a Christian. Of the three men whom I have known personally and who have shaped my self-understanding as a Christian most deeply, two were Jews, great spirits of blessed memory. I will tell you about each of them in a moment. The third is my father, Richard N. Solden, and I wish to say a word about him first because it will help you learn who I am. My father was born in the American Midwest, a land of vast horizons, wheat fields, and plains, but relatively few Jews. The son of a Methodist minister, as I am a United Methodist minister, my father also became a Methodist minister and served his first church at the age of 19. Drawn to the hermeneutics of Rudolf Bultmann, he earned a PhD in New Testament at Boston University, and he studied for a time in post-war Germany, a place that, like the American Midwest, but for different reasons, was also largely empty of Jews in the early 1960s. It was in Tübingen, Germany, that my parents tell me I spoke my first words. In 1964, my father was planning to resume work as a pastor in Kansas when a friend encouraged him to apply for a position teaching New Testament at a Black Baptist seminary in the American South. My father said, "No, I'm not Black, I'm not Baptist, and I'm not Southern." But my father did apply, and soon we were moving from the Yankee stronghold of Boston to Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the slaveholding Confederacy. My parents' decision, for my mother had a say too, was a courageous one. The great human division that troubled the times was between Black people and white people. The forces of white supremacy were still enormously powerful in the American South. The civil rights movement was young and its future uncertain. Since almost all Blacks and whites were also Christian, our racial division was not just a social problem, it was a Christian problem, a problem of Christian unity. Because our family was close to my father's seminary, I grew up with an experience that is quite common for Black Americans, but rare for white Americans. I was a racial minority in my neighborhood and in my schools. The overwhelming majority of my neighbors and classmates were Black. The few white families that chose to stay did so mostly out of Christian conviction. They were ministers and the like. But not all the white families that refused to flee to the suburbs were Christian. Some were Jewish, and they too, I'm sure, acted out of moral conviction, rooted in faith. Most of my school teachers were Black, but of those who were white, a good number were Jews who were committed to the cause of racial reconciliation in America in the 1960s and 70s. One of those teachers, a thoroughly secular Jew, encouraged me to apply to Yale University, back in the Yankee North, a thought that otherwise would never have crossed my mind. It was at Yale that I had the great good fortune to come under the influence of the Christian theologian Hans Frey, the first of two Jews who deeply shaped my self-understanding as a Christian. Hans Frey, it must be admitted, was an irregular Jew, a fact of which he was deeply conscious. He was born in Breslau, Germany in 1922 into a highly educated secular Jewish home. Frey's parents permitted him and his sister to be baptized at schools because they hoped it would shield them from the rising tide of German anti-Semitism. In 1935, his parents sent Hans to a Quaker school in England for the same reason. And it was there that Hans saw a picture of Jesus on the walls of his school and, quote, he knew that it was true. In 1938, Hans Frey and his family emigrated from Germany to the United States, and by a long and circuitous route, he arrived at Yale University as a professor of theology in 1957. One way to describe Hans Frey's impact on American theology is to say that he helped Americans learn how to understand the theology of Karl Barth. For most of the 20th century, Americans badly misunderstood Karl Barth. A main reason for this was that American Christians had learned from the fundamentalist modernist controversy to believe that political and theological views always moved in tandem. That was certainly my view as a teenager when I arrived at Yale. My experience growing up as a minority in Richmond had made me a convinced progressive in my politics, and my theological hero was, like my father, Rudolf Bultmann. Imagine my consternation and confusion when I took a small seminar with Hans Frey on Bultmann and Barth, and I learned about their respective roles during the German church struggle in the 1930s. While both men joined the confessing church in opposition to the Nazis, it was the more, quote, traditional Barth who was the active leader and the hermeneutical revolutionary, while Bultmann was the one who remained in the shadows. By my senior year of college, Hans Frey was more than my teacher. He was my mentor and counselor, really a second father figure. Under his guidance, I wrote my senior thesis on Martin Luther and Karl Barth's interpretation of Paul's letter to the Romans. And it was at that time that I first began to puzzle seriously over that remarkable letter, and especially over those astonishing chapters 9 through 11. Already I could clearly see a difference between the Paul of Luther and Bultmann and the Paul of Karl Barth. For Luther and Bultmann, the gospel of Jesus Christ made the relationship between Christian and Jew disjunctive, external, polemical. For them, Paul's key affirmation was found in Romans 3:21, where Paul writes, "But now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed for all who believe." For Luther and Bultmann, Romans 9 through 11 was little more than an afterthought. But for Karl Barth, Romans 9 through 11 was at the very heart of Paul's letter. In fact, for Barth, Paul's key affirmation was found in Romans 11:29, where Paul writes, "For God has consigned all to disobedience in order that he might have mercy on all." Understood from this vantage point, the gospel of Jesus Christ made the relationship of Christian and Jew conjunctive, internal, and hopeful. I did not know it at the time, but it was Karl Barth's view of the relationship of Christian and Jew that would influence Roman Catholic thinkers such as Karl Thieme and John Osterreicher, the one man a convert to Catholicism from Lutheranism, and the other a convert from Judaism. And it was Thieme and Osterreicher, in turn, who would prove decisive for the language of Nostra Aetate. It is in searching her own mystery that the Church discovers the spiritual bond that ties her to Abraham's stock. It's now my pleasure to speak to you of Michael Wyschogrod, a third person who has deeply shaped my understanding as a Christian. Michael was born in Berlin in 1928 into an observant Yiddish-speaking family. Hans Frey's parents, by the way, forbade their children from speaking Yiddish at home. Michael Wyschogrod was a personal witness of Kristallnacht at the age of 10. Michael and his family immigrated to Brooklyn in New York in 1939. And there Michael received a classic Talmudic education and subsequently studied philosophy and Talmud at Yeshiva University under Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, one of the leading Talmudists of the post-war era. Unlike Hans Frey, Michael Wyshegrod was an observant Jew throughout his life. Far from becoming a Christian, he wrote a short apologetic book expressly for Jews who were considering baptism. And in that book, he provided a host of reasons why they should never take that step. Yet Michael, like Hans Frey, was in his own way something of an irregular Jew, or at least an irregular Orthodox Jew. In 1964, Michael's teacher, Rabbi Soloveitchik, wrote a famous article in which he counseled Jews not to enter into dialogue with Christians on theological matters. However much Soloveitchik endorsed conversation with Christians in other areas of life. Michael disagreed with his influential teacher on this point, and Michael devoted much of his intellectual energy until his death in 2016 to theological engagement with Christians. It was a decision that proved an instrument of God's blessing for Christians like me, even if it did tend to make Michael Wyshegrod's influence in the Orthodox Jewish world a little bit smaller. Now I was back at Yale. I was working on my PhD. Hans Frey was dead. My principal advisor was George Lindbeck, a Lutheran ecumenist who had been an observer at Vatican II. My fellow PhD students and I were once again studying Paul's letter to the Romans, and we were focusing on Romans 9 through 11. Those chapters still fascinated me, as they always had, but I was no longer satisfied with Karl Barth. Paul seemed to be saying something, seeing something, that even Karl Barth could not put his finger on. I expressed my dissatisfaction to George Lindbeck, and he said, "Kendall, go read the work of Michael Wyshegrod," a name that was not known to me. To this day, I vividly remember sitting in the library at Yale, finishing a short essay by Michael Wyshegrod. Wishegrod's essay was already 2 decades old at the time I read it. The essay was called Israel, the Church, and Election, and it appeared in a dusty collection of essays on Nostra Aetate, which had been published in 1970, a few short years after the statement's promulgation in 1965. The editor of that anthology was John Osterreicher, the principal author of Nostra Aetate 4. Wishegrod's essay worked on me like a sort of theological shock therapy. It contained the most forceful and unapologetic statement of Jewish faith I had ever encountered. Yet instantly I knew that Michael Wyshegrod had helped me to see something in Paul that his Christian commentators had not seen. That something was the distinction between Jew and Gentile as a matter of abiding theological relevance for those who are Christian. Let me pause to emphasize the point. The distinction between Jew and Gentile has a different logic from the difference between Jew and Christian. When Christians think in terms of Christians and Jews, they tend to do 3 things. They make themselves, as Christians, central. They make Jews important insofar as they are related to Christians. And they leave out of consideration most of the world's people, who are, of course, neither Jew nor Christian. In contrast, when Christians appropriate for themselves the distinction between Jew and Gentile, they do something different. the architecture of their thought changes. For one thing, the Jewish people become significant in their own right because it is the people of God's election. For another, their thinking includes all human beings, for everyone is either a Gentile or a Jew. And finally, they come to recognize that their own identity as Gentiles, for most Christians are non-Jews, they come to realize their identity as Gentiles who have met the God of Israel in the person of Jesus Christ. By centering the distinction between Jew and Gentile in his essay, Michael Wishgrad did something both deeply Jewish and deeply witty, a common combination in my experience. He turned the tables on the Christian proclamation. Just as Nostra Aetate first divides the world into Christians and non-Christians, and then secondarily locates Jews among the non-Christians, so Wishgrad first writes of the elect and the non-elect, and only then does he speak of Gentile Christians as that portion of the unelected world that has been drawn to the love of the God of Abraham. The challenge that Wishgrad then poses to Gentile Christians like me is whether, having fallen in love with the God of Abraham, they can also love the people that God has chosen. As I finished Wishgrad's essay long ago, I realized with a shock of discovery that Wishgrad was closer to Paul than were his Christian interpreters. By treating the distinction of Jew and Gentile as a living reality, by addressing me as a Gentile in light of God's irrevocable election of Israel, Michael Wishgrad, Orthodox Jew, had helped me understand Paul better. And I believe he helped me understand myself as a Christian better. Later, I had the privilege of getting to know Michael Wishgrad personally, and he agreed to let me edit an anthology of his writings. One of the essays I included in that collection was, of course, the essay that changed my life. Permit me to close by reflecting a little bit more on this question. What enduring significance does the distinction of Jew and Gentile have from a Christian point of view? This is a question that puzzled John Oesterreicher, the original publisher of Wishgrad's essay. In his introduction to the original volume from 1970, Oesterreicher made the following observation about Wishgrad's essay. John Oesterreicher wrote, Michael Wishgrad holds that the Gentiles have been addressed by the Lord God, are loved by him who is their Father. Still, Wishgrad sees them as those who are not chosen. He even asks, quote, that the nations who seek the God of Israel meditate on their non-election, end of quote. He was quoting Michael Wishgrad. Then Oesterreicher resumes in his own voice, to a Christian mind, the two major assertions here do not square. For a Christian, to be addressed and to be loved simply means to be chosen. John Oesterreicher was correct that there is a long Christian tradition that understands being elected by God and being loved by God as synonyms. Charles Wesley, the 18th century hymn writer and hero of my Methodist tradition, we emphasize the universality of God's saving love in Christ. Charles Wesley expressed the sentiment in this way: Thou, God, hast all in Christ elected. Not a soul of the whole was by thee rejected. Nevertheless, what I have learned from conversation with Jews is that God's love for the Jewish people takes a special shape, that differentiates it as a corporate people from other families, peoples, tribes, and lineages. To be born a Jew is to be born into a human lineage with a proper name assigned to it by the explicit, authoritative Word of God. To become a Jew means to be adopted into this same lineage. Gentiles are not born into lineages of this sort, nor can they acquire a lineage of this sort except by becoming Jews. To be sure, as a Christian, I believe that Gentiles, no less than Jews, come into the world called and surrounded by God's love. But that love operates among Gentiles in ways other than by means of God's authoritative word that names and claims the birth communities into which we are born. Even the church does not exist in quite the same way that Israel does. Tertullian was correct. Christians are made, not born. Jews and Gentiles who are baptized into Christ are born from above, united to Christ and to each other in a new spiritual kinship group that is a foretaste of the new creation. But Jews who are baptized, like Hans Frey and John Osterreicher, do not thereby lose their status as members of God's chosen people, however irregular and defective this status becomes in the view of normative Judaism. Nor do Gentiles who are baptized cease to be Gentiles. We remain people who herald from and continue to participate in human communities that God has not called by name. I wish that the Gentile white Christians, the white Gentile Christians who first settled America, had understood this truth about themselves. If they had, they would not have equated being white with being elect. They would have been better able to recognize the theological nullity of all racial distinction while also recognizing the blessing that comes from cultural difference. I wish to give my final words to Michael Wishegrod. In his essay on Vatican II that changed my life as a Methodist Christian, Michael wrote the following: "Not to be the favorite son of a human father is a painful experience, but the non-election of God is never a finality, only one way of being touched by the finger of God. If in the election of Israel there is also chastisement of a sinful Israel, in the non-election of the nations there is also the Father's love for all of his children. In the end of days there will be a reconciliation of all the families of the earth without division. To foreshadow that day, the Jew must speak humbly of his election, the Gentile with love of his non-election, both awaiting together for the final redemption of creation." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Solon, for that really beautiful reflection on how friendship with individual Jews helped to shape how you think about yourself as a Christian. It was so beautiful when you mentioned reading in the Yale Library that essay, Israel, the Church, and Election, how it was sort of a theological shock therapy, a wonderful image there that helped you to recognize that for Paul, the distinction between Jew and Gentile was a matter of abiding theological relevance for the Christian. And what you've done in this talk, this beautiful reflection, is you've helped us to understand the implications of this. So we look forward to discussing it more after, during our time of dialogue. And just that last, I'd like to just quote one other line from your essay that was really touching. The challenge that Wyshegorod then poses to Gentile Christians is whether, having fallen in love with the God of Abraham, they can also love the people that God has chosen. So thank you for that thoughtful reflection. So our final speaker today is Rabbi Dr. David Sandmel, and he is the immediate past chair of the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, and he will address the question, how talking with Christians has changed how I think of myself as a Jew. So we look forward to hearing you, Rabbi Sandmel.
Well, thank you and good evening. It's a pleasure to be here at the Pontifical Gregorian University and with some very good friends on this panel. So thank you. I've been talking with Christians all my life. Now, this is not unusual for a Jew living outside of Israel. As a small minority in Christian majority societies, talking with Christians is simply a part of everyday life, an opportunity most Christians in the world don't have. But my own story is a little bit different, and you'll see that we're both talking about our families of origin here this evening. My father, Rabbi Samuel Sandmel, of blessed memory, was a scholar of New Testament and a pioneer of post-Shoah Jewish-Christian relations. My mother, Frances Fox Sandmel, also of blessed memory, was involved in dialogue in her own right. In 1959, she published a children's novel about interreligious relations that was positively reviewed in the New York Times. For several years, my mother put on a model Seder for the sisters at a convent in our neighborhood. I tagged along to help out and to chant the 4 questions. I have vivid memories of those Sidarim to this day, and the attention showered on me by the sisters, who seemed to be under the impression that I was adorable. On any given evening, especially on Shabbat and on Passover, my parents regularly hosted Christian clergy, scholars, and theologians. Though initially all these guests were Protestants, the 1965 promulgation of Nostra Aetate changed things dramatically. Suddenly, priests and nuns were regularly seated around our dining room table. Though the conversations were often over my head, the impact of these evenings stayed with me. The environment of the home in which I grew up and these early experiences with Christians undoubtedly played a central role in the trajectory of my rabbinic, academic, and dialogic life, and certainly influenced how I think of myself as a Jew. One of my Christian colleagues used to say that the point of Jewish-Christian dialogue was to help Christians, quote, clean up their mess, close quote. I'm also reminded of the comment made by a Jewish scholar at the end of a retreat for Christian clergy when asked, well, what do the Jews want from us? Her answer, which I think she just blurted out without thinking, was, just leave us alone. Now, while I understand the history and the emotions that lie behind these comments, even if poorly expressed, and recognize the importance of eliminating ignorance and anti-Jewish prejudice, I was taught, and I have always believed, that dialogue was more complex, richer, and ultimately more rewarding than simply a strategy for combating anti-Semitism. though that too was, and as we know all too painfully these days, it remains very relevant. We use the term interfaith dialogue or relations, both of which suggest a two-way conversation, ideally among equals, if at least on the interpersonal, and the human level, if not always on the communal or institutional level. Thus, true dialogue cannot be just an opportunity to explain ourselves to the religious other. It must include an equal share of listening to and learning about the other. And this is key. In dialogue, we inevitably learn about ourselves in ways that might never happen if we only talk to our own. Speaking with someone outside one's community often requires a different kind of precision and explication. There may not be shared vocabulary or a common frame of reference, or we may use the same words but with very different meanings and nuances. Things that we take for granted in one setting might need to be defined in another. This is true of theological discourse or biblical interpretation, but also, the most challenging, in the communication of lived experience. I have found that in dialogue, one of the most productive aspects are the questions that can be insightful, penetrating, as well as deceptively simple questions that if we talk only among ourselves might never be asked, and which can lead us to consider something in our own tradition in a new or a different light. In the decades since the Shoah, the dialogue of Jews and Christians has evolved and deepened and continues to do so. This has certainly been my experience, both on a personal and on an institutional level. One of the alternative titles that we discussed among ourselves for our talks this evening was, "Who am I as a Jew when I dialogue with a Christian?" Or you can change the titles in there, the religions in there. This is a provocative question because my experience in dialogue has been both as an individual and in a leadership role as the representative of Jewish communal organizations. I'm a very specific Jew. I'm an American Jew, a diaspora Jew, of the immediate post-Shoah generation. I'm a rabbi ordained in the Reform movement, the liberal or progressive movement, and a student of Jewish-Christian relations. I'm the child of a rabbi, the parent of a rabbi, and I could go on. In some settings or occasions, I can present myself in all my particularity. I can speak about what I believe and how I live my Jewishness. I am, of course, the same person when I am officially representing a Jewish communal organization, but in those situations, I must speak in terms of we rather than I. One example of this is the issue of theological dialogue, which has already been touched upon this evening. Some of the Orthodox Jewish partners with whom I work consider dialogue with Christians about specific theological topics to be inappropriate. And again, as Kendall has mentioned, many have point to the influential article by Rabbi Soloveitchik, one of the towering figures of Orthodox Jewry in the second half of the 20th century, and someone with whom Father Rudeshauser is very well familiar. The details of Soloveitchik's concerns are not relevant now. The point is that when I am part of a group that includes Orthodox Jewish colleagues who hold this position, I respect it and I adhere to it. I might sometimes chafe at this limitation, and I'm well aware that it can be frustrating for some of our Christian interlocutors. For the greater good of the community, however, I am willing to restrict myself in such settings. in navigating this aspect of Jewish-Christian dialogue, I have gained a deeper understanding and appreciation of this important dynamic, my sense of responsibility to Klal Yisrael, the wider community of Israel. This has been very clarifying for me regarding the differences between Jewish and Christian concepts of identity, often described in terms of Jewish peoplehood as compared to Christian faith, both of which, of course, are much more complicated than that simple formulation implies. Through encounters with Christians, I have gained new perspectives and a deeper appreciation for the significance of the Talmudic teaching: an Israelite, even one who sins, remains an Israelite. As Daniel Boyarin explains it, one remains part of the Jewish, the text says Israelite, but the Jewish people, whether or not one adheres to Torah, ascribes to its major precepts, or affiliates with the community. This came to be understood to mean that one cannot cease to be a Jew even via apostasy. Boyarin argues that this idea was formulated in response to the emergence of the Christian understanding of religion as a system of beliefs and practices to which one adheres voluntarily, and rejection of which results in one becoming a heretic. The rabbis decided to define the borders of their community in a very different way. In Boyarin's terms, the rabbis refused religion, which has had deep significance for the subsequent development of Jewish self-understanding. Of course, those classical rabbis could not have imagined, and probably would not have approved, of much that is considered Jewish today. And what I mean by that is how those who identify as Jews express their Jewishness. The diversity of expressions of Jewishness within the community today and the arguments over them can be attributed in part to this refusal of denying a person's identity based on their belief. These contemporary expressions of Jewishness and the discourse around them within this community are the focus of a course that I'm privileged to teach here at the Gregorian, and I note that all my students are here, so you all get extra credit. So, since the rabbis refused religion, this raises the question, what in fact we mean when we talk about Judaism as a religion. According to Boyarin, and here I quote, "It seems highly significant that there is no word in pre-modern Jewish parlance that means Judaism as a religion, as I have just defined it. Judaism, the term, is used as the name of the Jewish religion only by writers who do not themselves identify with and by that name, well into the 19th century." I'm now going to quote Boyarin at a little more length. "It might seem then that Judaism has not, until sometime in modernity, existed at all. That whatever moderns might be tempted to abstract out, to disembed from the culture of Jews and call their religion, was not ascribed particular status by Jews until very recently. Until our present moment, it could be argued, Judaism both is and is not a religion. On one hand, for many purposes, it operates as a religion within multi-religious societies. Jews claim for their religion a semantic, cultural status parallel to that of Christianity in the West. On the other hand, there are many ways that Jews continue to be uncomfortable and express their discomfort with this very definition. versions of descriptions or practice with respect to Judaism that treat it as a faith that can be separated from ethnicity, language, and shared history have felt false. Another thing that I have learned while speaking with Christians is the importance of unpacking this term religion, and not just when in dialogue with Christians. There are Jews today who do think of Judaism as a religion based on Christian rather than Jewish assumptions about faith as the sine qua non. It's part of the cultural heritage. My interactions with Christians have led me to consider closely the idea of religion and what it means to be religious in a Jewish context, not only in antiquity, but also today. Now, this in turn has enabled me to provide Jews who are conflicted or ambivalent about their Jewishness, especially when it comes to matters of belief or practice, with a perspective to see themselves and their Jewishness as in authentic Jewish terms rather than in Christian terms. For those Jews who do not hold traditional Jewish beliefs about God or Torah, who do not live a lifestyle rooted in those beliefs, which is a significant percentage, and who may not be all that familiar with the Jewish tradition, the realization that their core Jewishness is not therefore invalidated can be liberating and empowering for them. I want to say a few words about the placing of the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews within the Secretariat, now Dicastery, for promoting Christian unity. This has also influenced how I think about myself as a Jew. First, I note that on the website, the Commission seems to have one name in English and another name in Italian and in French. In English on its website, it is called the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. In French, and I ask you to forgive me for my French and Italian accent, in French it's called the Commission pour les relations religieuses avec le judaïsme, and in Italian, the Commissioni per i rapporti religiosi con l'ebraismo. So, all three referred to religious relations, but each uses actually a different term to refer to Jews or Judaism. Now, I understand that in Italian, ebraismo is understood to mean Judaism, but I do note that semantic difference nonetheless. And I don't want to read too much into what may be, for the church, a very insignificant choice of words on a website. From my perspective, however, there is a big difference between the Catholic relationship with Jews and its relationship with Judaism. This is explicit in the 1974 Vatican Guidelines and Suggestions for the Implementation of the Conciliar Declaration Nostra Aetate 4, already cited. The problem of Jewish-Christian relations concerns the Church as such, since it is when pondering her own mystery that she encounters the mystery of Israel. And then goes on, and I stress this, therefore, even in areas where no Jewish communities exist, this remains an important problem. It seems then that the Church's relation to Judaism is, in some way, independent or disconnected from its relationship with Jews. Or perhaps another way to put it is that the Church has its own notion or understanding of Judaism that is certainly similar to those held by at least some Jews, but may not be identical. This seems to me to be something worthy of further joint exploration. As a side note, I want to underscore and support the guideline statement that Jewish-Christian relations are important even where no Jewish communities exist. As the Church's center of gravity shifts towards the global South, Catholics and other Christians, for that matter, will only encounter Jews through their reading of the Bible or theological studies. What will be the motivation to learn about post-conciliar teaching about Jews and Judaism? I've had the privilege of teaching with two Sisters of Zion at a Catholic seminary in Harare, Zimbabwe, which unfortunately is closing. For most of the students, I was the first Jew they had ever met. It was also in this class that most of the students encountered Nostra Aetate for the first time. Next year will be the 60th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, an opportunity for the Church, if I may be so bold, to celebrate this most important document. Because my experience is that it is not nearly as well known in the Catholic world as it should be. The fact that the Commission for Religious Relations with Jews/Judaism is housed in the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity is something that honestly strikes Jews as odd. Some immediately think that it has a missionary intent, but of course the Church has been clear that it does not engage in targeted missions to Jews, and as stated in Gifts and Calling, that the Jews are participants in God's salvation is theologically unquestionable, but how that can be possible without confessing Christ explicitly is and remains an unfathomable divine mystery. It seems clear that Jews and Judaism, together or separately, have significance in the quest for Christian unity that is not the case for other religious communities, relationships with which fall under the aegis of the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue rather than the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity. Nostra Aetate connected its bonds with the Jews, the stock of Abraham, to its quest to understand itself, to search its own mystery. And again, you see we come back to some of the same quotes. As Pope St. John Paul II famously said, the Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain way is intrinsic to our own religion. With Judaism, therefore, we have a relationship we do not have with any other religion. There is something profound about the idea that my tradition and my people, and perhaps even myself in all my Jewish specificity, have theological significance for the Church. And even more so, that we or I, in some way, might play a role in its eschatology. Are there implications of this for Jews? Or is this purely an inter-Catholic or ecumenical conversation? If so, this would surely change how I think of myself as a Jew. It's another topic that I would like to see on the agenda, and which does have the potential to change how I think of myself as a Jew. I can't resist concluding with a joke. The Messiah arrives, and the media show up with cameras and microphones. A reporter shouts a question. Is this your first or second visit? Now, I don't know if this story is true, but I was told that someone told this joke to Martin Buber, who responded, if I were there, I would whisper in the Messiah's ear, don't answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Sandmel, for this really insightful reflection. And it's so obvious that the good example of your parents, who were so committed to dialogue, had really a profound impact on you. So thank you for this.